first review where I went and saw an early screening. Okay. Welcome back to Arguing Semantics. I'm James, and today, as the title suggests, we are doing a review of Death on the Nile. Death on the Nile is the latest Agatha Christie Poirot adaptation from director and star Kenneth Branagh. Featuring a large eclectic cast, Death on the Nile tells the story of Poirot as he once again is dropped in the middle of another mystery. This time in Egypt, when a friend of his gets him accidentally invited into a honeymoon party on the Nile itself. As the party goes on and tempers flare, one of the members ends up dead, forcing Poirot to cut his vacation short in order to solve this crime before the murderer can escape. Okay, so, being a mystery movie, even though it's based on a book and a previous film, I am going to try to keep spoilers at a minimum, but just be aware that something may come up. The first thing I will state right away is I did enjoy the movie. That being said, it is incredibly flawed. It was interesting watching this as the follow-up to Murder on the Orient Express. I feel like Murder on the Orient Express, the biggest problems with it were that the plot was incredibly well written, but the direction was a bit self-indulgent. There were a lot of moments and shots and action sequences that were completely unnecessary to the plot that just ended up making the movie feel a little bloated, but was still very, very good. Not the best adaptation, but a very, very good one. Enough that I would like to see where Kenneth Branagh would go moving forward. It is clear that he does have a passion for the source material. His interpretation of Poirot in particular is great. He is really the standout in both movies. His changing of Poirot to a little bit more OCD is a really nice touch and really helps round out his character. The fact that he is so particular but so charismatic and people like him anyway, it is always a nice touch. On the movie itself, overall, I feel like the cinematography was still good, the compositions were good, the setting was well done. I think on a pure technical level, this was a good movie, except for one aspect. There is some CGI in the movie, and it is far less realistic, and sometimes can be a bit distracting. Just feels a little rushed. As far as the overall movie itself, it was a little weird and felt a little half-baked. It starts with an intro sequence that's there to give a little bit more of background on Poirot himself, which I feel like was just there to kind of give some excuses as to why he's a little bit more OCD and why he has a mustache. But it didn't totally work, especially when you find out why he has a mustache. It kind of would affect his ability to grow a mustache. The performances were good for the most part. The standout being Kenneth Branagh himself, like I said, totally nailed it. Having Book return from the previous movie was also a lot of fun, considering he was one of the standouts in the original, even if he was kind of a one-note character. But they gave him a lot to do in this one. He was much more integrated into the plot, which was delightful. His whole little arc was probably the best thing about this movie. Overall, the performances were good. Like, I liked each of the individual performances. The only problem were a couple of them felt like they were coming from completely different movies. Like, Russell Brand's character was interesting and very grounded and down to earth. The lawyer character was also very, straightforward. But then you had the socialist godmother who was really over the top. You had Book was over the top, but he feels like he should be. It totally fits. But then you also have the two American characters that are in there that also feel weird and over the top. They're doing a stylistic thing that totally would work. It just feels at odds with some of the other things happening in the movie. Most of the rest of the cast is great, but they weren't really given a whole lot to work with. There's only so much they can all do. Unlike the last one where it felt like you got all the information you needed, this one it felt like they were given just enough so that they had some screen time, and that was about it. It also didn't help that a couple of their performances were pretty weak. Most notably, Gal Gadot was not very good in this movie. She felt completely out of place with the rest of the project and just underwhelming and wooden. I've never been a big fan of Gal Gadot. I think she's serviceable as Wonder Woman, but there was also some stuff with the way they plotted the movie that felt weird. Like I said, the intro sequence was weird, and then the intro sequence after that was a little bit weird with Poirot going to a nightclub. There was some sexy dancing in a jazz club in London, and it just felt like a little bit much. Just felt uncomfortable and long and just like, why is this happening? Which also played into later moments where there were supposed to be sexy things happening and it didn't really work. And part of that was Gal Gadot and Armie Hammer, who plays her fiance, had little to no chemistry. It wasn't there, so it felt awkward. But as far as the actual plot goes, there were a few ways in how it was executed where the story just didn't make a whole lot of sense. The overall plot was a little bit convoluted. The problem with starting with Murder on the Orient Express is, for those who have seen it or know the story, Murder on the Orient Express has one of the best endings of any mystery ever. It is completely surprising, and you don't see it coming, despite the fact that all the details are there. Which is the other thing that movie did much better. So, following up one of the best stories of all time with one that's a little more convoluted felt weird. The emotions were more interesting to delve into, and there were twists and turns throughout it that were interesting. The middle portion of it was overall pretty good, but the ultimate solution felt really weird. The actual murder plan has so many holes in it that how anyone would come to that as their plan is absolutely ludicrous. With how the movie plays out after the initial murder just makes that ever more clear. And with how the plot kept twisting and turning, and the fact that we never felt like we were getting all the information we needed at any one time, just made the whole plot feel convoluted. The other big problem, as I was mentioning before, is that in a good mystery, you get all the details you need that if you wanted to, you could figure it out on your own. And this movie does not do that. I feel like all of the interviews that he did were more about getting little details about the characters themselves more than explaining how things happening. It was much more about revealing the characters than to revealing the plot, which is a problem. If you're making a mystery, the plot is just as important as the characters. And it felt like it was so over-focused on the characters that the plot got pushed to the wayside. Also, some of the twists and reveals that happen with some of those characters, they feel interesting, but they don't feel necessary and don't add anything to the story, so it just kind of turned into a bit of a mishmash. And then when you get to the final reveal, where Poirot is giving his whole speech that he does in every movie, which has a much more emotional bent than it does in previous works or other stories, which is probably why he chose this one as the second one, it felt overwrought and empty because there were a whole bunch of details that they were keeping close to the chest or didn't, like they implied them, but didn't give you any visual or other expositional clues to figure them out on your own. So the ending felt like a jump and also kind of ended really awkwardly. And then, of course, after that, there is a postscript sequence where they go back to the club in London that also felt a little bit weird. I think it was supposed to be a character moment for Poirot, but just felt like, why is this happening? Why are we here? It felt like he was so focused in this one to tell the story of Poirot, he forgot to tell Death on the Nile. And then there were some other issues where, in a good mystery, you are introduced to the character slowly and steadily, which is something that they did really well in Murder on the Orient Express. You're introduced to all the characters in a really good way, whereas in this one, they introduce a few of the elements, but most of the actual exposition is literally Poirot shows up at the party and Book says, hey, that's that person and that's their deal. 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 So Book just literally tells you all the information that you need, plus more that ends up being completely unnecessary. Plus there was another little element where the last movie set up this movie, and then they just all but ignore the setup from the other movie by basically saying, hey, good job, you solved that case in Egypt, which then makes it so he went to Egypt, solved the case, came back to London, did some stuff, then went back to Egypt immediately afterwards. It was the weirdest way to get around the setup for the last movie, which you can tell was like, we just wanted to say we're going to do Death on the Nile next, but had no plan for how to execute on that. It was really, really dumb. It was a deeply flawed movie. But, once again, to the positives, Kenneth Branagh as Poirot was great. He clearly has a passion for that character, and I would like to see him continue to play it. Most of the cast was great. The setting was fantastic. The cinematography in this movie is actually really, really great. They have some really good shot compositions. They pick some really good angles. The lighting is great. They do a lot of really, really cool one-shots to actually show the pacing of how different events were happening. It felt half-baked. It felt like Kenneth Branagh had a lot of ideas for how he wanted to develop the Poirot character, and then tried to shove those into a different movie. Like I said, I did enjoy watching it. The actual moment-to-moment storytelling is good, and many of the twists are good. It feels nice to see this kind of a mystery film get a good budget to work with. We don't get enough of those these days, and I hope he'll be able to keep making more, though where it ended in the final moments feels like an ending, so I don't know if we're going to get more after this. Also, it depends on if the movie actually makes any money, which we'll see. An Agatha Christie mystery is a hard sell. Overall, I give it a go ahead and watch it. It is a flawed movie, but it is a good movie. It's just not the best mystery I've ever heard, and I feel like it suffers from the fact they chose to do this one after Murder on the Orient Express. It feels like Orient Express should have been one of the last ones they go to instead of the very first. It's definitely worth a watch, so if that's what's playing at your local cinema, go ahead and see it. You're not going to feel like you wasted your time. Anyway, that being said, my name is James, and this has been Arguing Semantics.